Okay, in this last section, we're going to be talking about lipids. And there's three main classes of lipids that we need to be responsible for. We have fatty acids, which are fats, okay, and this is the saturated, the polyunsaturated, and the monounsaturated. And then you have phospholipids and steroids. And with lipids, these are not polymers, recall. These are these long fatty acid chains attached to a glycerol head through a dehydration reaction. And in this reaction, what you get is the water is being given off as the hydroxyl group is being lost from the fatty acid chain, and the hydrogen is being lost from the glycerol head, as you can see right here. So this is where you're losing that water molecule, and then you have this long fatty acid chain being added to the glycerol head. And you do that 3 times, and this is where you're getting these triglyceride molecules from. Okay, the fatty acid portion, of course, remember we said is 16 to 18 carbons in length, and these portions are hydrophobic, and this is what makes fats hydrophobic. And recall we said that we can classify these fats as being saturated or unsaturated, and this is what we often hear about from the food standpoint if you read the labels, things like that. And when the carbon atom is the carbons that are on the fatty acid chains, when those have the maximum number of hydrogens that they can possibly hold, in other words, no double bonds between any of the carbons, we say that we have a saturated fat. And these saturated fats are generally solids at room temperature, things like butters and animal fats and things like we discussed in class. That's what, you can see the 3 chains kind of are in a line, they stack and pack together real well, and that's what allows them to be a solid at room temperature. Okay, unsaturated fats, by contrast, contain some carbon-carbon double bonds, and these double bonds introduce a little kink into the molecule, and that's what allows these things to be oils or liquids at room temperature. So if you look at like olive oil, you can see that slight bend. Fish oil, vegetable oil, things like that, they have these molecules that have these slight bends in them, and that's what allows them to be a liquid at room temperature. Okay. So lipids are generally what animals and things use as long-term storage for energy. Carbohydrates like glycogen and so forth, these are short-term energy, and these are stored in your liver and muscle, whereas the lipids are stored in adipose tissue, which are made up of adipocytes. These are just fat cells, basically. Okay, so the reason lipids, as we discussed in class, is you can get a lot more energy than you do from a protein or a carbohydrate. For instance, you get 9 calories per gram in fat versus 4 calories per gram in proteins and carbohydrates. And in addition to that, it only takes up about 1/6 the amount of mass that you would take to store an equivalent amount of carbohydrate. So the lipids have a lot more energy and they're a lot more lightweight. And what we talked about, the reason being is because the storage of the carbohydrates in the muscle and the liver and things like that, it requires water, and water is very heavy. And so if we wanted to have the same amount of energy in our carbohydrate stores, our glycogen stores, we would have a lot more water associated with it. So it would be, we'd be very massive, be very heavy, it'd be a lot to carry around. It wouldn't be very advantageous from an evolutionary standpoint for avoiding predators and things like that. And it's also critical for certain organisms that have to store their energy that fly, for instance, like bats and birds and things like that. So there's all sorts of advantages to using the lipids. And then we talked about some of the other advantages that the lipids give us in terms of like insulation, protection of the body, and that sort of thing. Lipids now, some of the trade-off of lipids versus the glycogen. The lipids are easier to carry, they're lightweight, they've got more energy, but the glycogen is a lot more easily called upon to get into the bloodstream for quick energy. Okay? Now back to fats. When we were talking about fats, we said fats can be saturated or unsaturated. So here you have a saturated fat. You can see there's no double bonds between any of the carbons. You've got a maximum amount of carbon or hydrogens attached to these carbon molecules. So those things pack together real nice, and that's what gives us solids at room temperature. You find them in things like butter and milk and cheese and animal fats and so forth. Palm oil, coconut oil, these are very high in saturated fats, but they're kind of an exception to the rule of being a solid at room temperature. They kind of are, but they kind of aren't. They're very soft, and so there are some exceptions. Nothing is really an absolute. We talked about monounsaturated fat. So mono, of course, meaning one, and these are unsaturated. There's a double bond somewhere. So there's one double bond somewhere, and this introduces that kink to the molecule, and that's what's going to allow it to stay liquid at room temperature. certain things like olive oil, canola oil, soybean oil, fish oil, seeds and nuts in some vegetables are very rich in these monounsaturated fatty acids, which are good for our heart health and our brain and so forth. Polyunsaturated fats, now poly meaning many, so there's two or more carbon-carbon double bonds throughout the fatty acid chain, and that's what's going to introduce the kinks and again allow them to be liquids at room temperature. And these types of things are like omegas, omega-3s, omega-6s. You find them in corn oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, walnuts, flax seeds, fish, things like that. And these are good for your heart health. They're good for brain. And again, they're polyunsaturated. They're liquids at room temperature, and they've got a lot of health benefits. Okay, so we also talked about cis and trans types of fats. So the cis means that the hydrogens, of course, are on the same side of this double bond, and this introduces that kink and allows it to be a liquid. Trans, of course, means opposite, and this is where you have the hydrogens on the opposite sides of that double bond, and that allows the molecule to kind of be more of a linear form versus having the kink in it. So that kind of linear form allows it to behave like a saturated fat, but not have the stigma that's associated with saturated fat. And these trans fats, of course, we said for the most part are produced through hydrogenation. They're artificially produced, and this makes them ideal for the food industry because you can call it unsaturated fat, but it behaves like the saturated fat. And it's the thing that makes like margarine buttery and soft, so it's easy to spread. Crisco that you cook with used to be made with a lot of trans fats. And Jif peanut butter, okay, so you can keep it in the cabinet and it doesn't get separated out. So that's hydrogenated oils. That's how you produce these trans fats. And a lot of the food companies really got turned on to them because they could say that they contained no saturated fat, yet they had the properties of it. But they found that they're really unhealthy for you, so they started taking them out of the foods. Okay, so now that we're talking about the saturated fats, trans fats, heart health, things like that, there's a lot of claims about the effects of the different types of fats on human health. And the main risk factor that you often hear about is coronary heart disease, and the risks associated with blocking these coronary arteries with these fatty deposits, cholesterol deposits, things like that are going to lead to heart attacks. And there's a positive correlation that's been found between the intake of saturated fats and the rates of coronary heart disease. And it's important to keep in mind that correlation does not mean causation, because there could also be other things involved in the diets of the people that are taking in high fats. For instance, they could be lead a sedentary life, they don't move around much, they don't exercise much, they have a low fiber intake. And one of the things that kind of supports this notion of correlation and causation is there's a population of people in Kenya called the Maasai, and they have a diet that's very rich in meat, fat, blood, milk, and it's not skim milk, it's whole milk, things like that. And they have a very high consumption of saturated fats, but coronary heart disease is almost unheard of in this population. And so there's other factors that are at play, and a lot of it has to do with other things that they're intaking, genetics, how much they move around, and so forth. And it's also been found that diets very rich in olive oil and other types of cis monounsaturated fats, such as countries in the Mediterranean that are eating these types of diets, they have a very low rate of coronary heart disease as well. So there might be some genetics involved as well as the diet, and again, how much you move around, how sedentary your life is, etc. So there's a lot of things kind of at play. And other aspects of the diet, of course, could be in there. Like, for instance, in the Western diets, especially since before they started taking these trans fats out, there was a positive correlation between the amount of trans fats that were consumed and the amount of coronary heart disease. And so when you started looking at all of these other risk factors, there weren't a lot that could account for the correlation. And, you could tie this in really with a lot of the trans fats. So what it was kind of, the conclusion that was reached is that these trans fats were probably responsible for the coronary heart disease, because a lot of the people who died, when they did the autopsies, they looked at the fatty deposits in these diseased arteries, the coronary arteries around the heart and so forth, and they found that they contained a lot of trans fats, very high concentration to it. And so this lends more evidence to this link. okay, this causal link. In other words, what's causing the differences. In that tribe in Kenya that did not, or that did eat, excuse me, the high concentrations of saturated fats, had 0 trans fats in their diet. So that could kind of show you what's going on. So there's a lot to the picture, but when you really start looking at it, you can see how they kind of arrived at the conclusion that the trans fats were so bad for you. Okay? So another thing we discussed was the idea of the body mass index, and it's just a general tool, especially the one that we used for looking at possible weight problems, okay, and looking at the BMIs, whether you're underweight, normal weight, overweight, or obese, just by taking a few measurements. And the units for the BMI are the kilogram per meter squared. So you take your mass in kilograms and you divide it by your height in meters, meters squared. Okay, and then that gives you your BMI, and then you can use a chart here. And we talked about this, kind of looking at how do you go about using this. I'm about 6'3", 205, 210 pounds. So if you move it over, you see my body mass index is right around 26, and that would say that I'm overweight. And we talked about in class how it's a very kind of rough estimate. There's many other ways that you can go about doing this, because I'm certainly not an overweight person. You know, if you just look at certain aspects of a person in terms of their muscle mass, how tall they are, how active they are, and many other things, there's other factors that kind of play into that. Okay, so it's something that kind of needs to be taken with a grain of salt. We showed you this type of a chart where you can take your, plot your weight on the left column, you can plot your height on the right column and connect the 2 dots with a ruler, and then figure out where it intersects the body mass index in the middle there, and then you can determine your BMI from that. So there's a variety of types of things that we looked at to make sure that we could use the charts and the information to kind of answer the questions that we might be asked. Okay, so phospholipids, these are a very important molecule that are very similar to fats, except they only have 2 fatty acids attached to this glycerol head, and they have a phosphate group attached to the other one. Okay, and this phosphate group is negatively charged, and what this does is it allows the phospholipid to be both hydrophobic and hydrophilic, and we say that that's amphipathic, and this is going to kind of be important when we start talking about cell membranes. And what this does is it kind of makes up this phospholipid bilayer. So this phospholipid bilayer, you can see you've got this negatively charged hydrophilic head kind of pointing outwards towards the water, and then you have the 2 fatty acid chains pointing inward, and that's going to create this hydrophobic layer in between the two, so you can kind of separate the watery interior of the cell with the watery exterior of the cell, and then that's what allows the cell essentially to be a cell, to have that internal chemistry which is different from the surroundings, and then that's what is going to allow life to exist and so forth. So we'll kind of get, when we start talking about the cell and the cell membrane, we'll talk more about these phospholipids. Okay, the last thing to kind of talk about here are steroids. And this is a class of lipids that are basically comprised of a bunch of functional groups attached to a general ring structure like you see here. A, B, C, and D, those are the rings. And all of these different carbons have different things attached to them. And, cholesterol is a common example of this type of a ring. It's a important sterol. It serves as a precursor to many of the hormones in the body, many of which are hormones, many of which are steroids. It's a component of the animal cell membranes. Okay, so there's a lot of things, a lot of important things that steroids are important for. And one of the kind of connotations that comes to mind with steroids is like anabolic steroids, things that athletes take to kind of enhance their appearance or to enhance their performance, things like that. And certainly those are examples of steroids, but not all steroids are bad. Not all steroids are like that. For instance, some of the common steroids, you have testosterone and estrogen, cortisol, stress type of a hormone. So these are the different types of common, naturally occurring steroids that you would find in your body. Males have a lot of testosterone generally and a small amount of estrogen generally, and vice versa in females. Females generally have a large amount of estrogen and a small amount of testosterone. Okay, so those are the common steroids. So make sure now, if you have any questions on any of the things that we talked about, you write that down, and we'll talk about it more in class. Okay? So have a good one. We'll talk to you soon.